One.
Lame.
Welcome to another Mish-Mashing Battle Lounge with the 2MK team. Today we are planning to get at least some more loot practice in. Or rather, practice against loot, with only one person actually playing loot, but we'll see what happens. Lounge is already starting to get kind of full, but probably in a good way. But as you can see, there's no loot yet. Instead, Spine is facing off with choose a 1926 of the no discard. No jump, right. That was good. So, I've said many times on this stream before that there are basically two types of Ed, those that play footsies and those that don't. So it's rather uncommon to meet an Ed that knows how to play just enough footsies, but not really spend a lot of time doing that, because it's not necessarily a strength of this character by most people's standards. He has a lot of good tricks and a lot of good movement, so he doesn't have to play footsies as much in the first place.
Round one. Fight!
This is the sort of thing Jasmine usually enjoys fighting, even though she tends to be a little bit harder to actually do, since there's a lot more movement here. Bison's not always the best matchup for her either. Because as Ed often points out, this doesn't really matter if you can't catch him. But we're looking to therefore get some relatively even matches. And interesting things happen. Those who joined Lounge at the beginning are possibly clearing out right now. We got a lot of people from all over the world. And unfortunately, while this is a pretty inclusive lounge in terms of who can join it and have a reasonably good connection, there are limits. So if you find yourself in South America, further to the eastern half of Europe, or on the west coast of the United States, you may not be able to get a good game. However, if your internet is really good, we won't necessarily mind you trying it out at least. This is generally though an Atlantic Rim lounge. If you find that you have any access to the Atlantic Ocean or have recently seen it, you can probably join in and manage to get some good games. In terms of connection, if your internet is poor, the rollback will usually handle it, but, you know, just don't play too dirty, I guess.
Round one.
And by that I mean take advantage of the lag because it makes things unreactable sometimes. Some characters really can't help it, but, you know. Yep, even without loot, it looks like we are getting more boxing on today. This is probably the ideal amount of footsies to play. Just enough to make your opponent think that you're going to do more things, so you can actually get to jump or hit crazy buttons because they are going to stick out theirs. Especially since against Bison, that doesn't really help at all.
Round two.
Since Ed has such a convoluted startup to his projectile, even when you do change the speed of it, Bison tends to get it anyway. So retreating to use this move isn't usually helpful. Faking out, however, as you've just seen, might actually be worth it. Around because I'm relatively interested to see what happens when they play against our even more defensive players. Not necessarily players who are innately much more defensive, because I think Just Fine takes the cake on that, but she will generally not just stick in defense mode and will use other options, whereas we have other players that don't do this. And I'm interested because they've pulled off a lot of moves that connect, but aren't necessarily a good idea to use if your opponent's very blocking. The question is whether or not they're doing so because they've noticed that their opponent will challenge fairly often, or not. We were actually discussing something specific the other day about whether or not an opponent is functionally timid, bold, or a joker is probably the wrong way to put it, but someone who is thinking of the battle in terms of taunting. And the precise things that this causes the player to do aren't necessarily directly connected to whether or not they are one or the other. You can find a timid player that hits buttons because they think it will prevent them from having to deal with their stuff, and you can find a bold player that basically doesn't hit buttons because they're so sure that you are going to mess up and they'll get to punish you. Like, I don't even have to defend against this thing. So, the first thing we're definitely having to think about today is which type of player this is. Ryu is a good way to test and find this out when dealing with most people, so maybe we'll get some information that way if, in fact, they pick Ryu. This is a character select on Lounge today. If you are searching, the lounge is almost full, but only almost. And we do in fact have a Ryu Ed matchup, which gives me a little time to talk about that since Luke is not fighting yet.
Round one.
You can even see this at higher levels of play. The bold player is usually, at high levels, the bold one is usually the one hitting buttons in neutral. It's harder to tell at lower levels because neutral doesn't always last as long. But lots of neutral play at higher levels makes it a little clearer. Usually the one that should be treated as a, let's call it timid one, is blocking and waiting for them. But you can tell that they're the timid one because in neutral, the opponent is not required to give you that opportunity. Meaning that you could, and this honestly happens to a lot of people in our matches, just end up standing around or trying to escape from possible bad situations and never actually doing anything. Most people will eventually do something crazy and hope you can't counter it, but that's still just hoping you can't counter it. These two, however, both seem to be on the relatively bold side, which means that it's much more likely that their matches are going to be explosive. Even these interactions where they were separated for a while is usually based on stuff like that, looking for an opportunity to be bold about something. Setting up scenarios where the opponent will have to do something to get parried, for example. And here you can definitely see the sort of judgment and movement required to make this work. Confident isn't quite the word to use though, because players that we can call timid are usually still fairly confident. They're simply confident that when you eventually make a mistake because of their style of play, they will be able to capitalize on that error. Or that if you then start to play very defensively yourself, that they have some options or can figure out what it is that they will do to take advantage of you becoming, let's continue to call it timid yourself. But when both players are bold, it's usually a race, or rather, a contest to see who will get discouraged fastest. This may not at all affect how the match turns out. That has a lot to do with execution skill and similar things. Just match up data knowledge and match up data. But here, since neither of these players is easy to discourage yet, they'll keep on moving toward each other in certain situations. Or at least, take more risks based on spacing than others will.
Round 2.
Which means that regardless of who wins, it looks like we're going to get exciting fights today. One of the benefits, however small, of playing this way, especially when you're not being too serious about winning, is the outcome you get from learning which buttons help you with what strings. Timid players tend to learn punishes first, and really good defense, and bold players tend to learn offense and tricky with punishes and similar. I wonder if it's lagging or if they're just back. This is in fact one of the boldest Ryu I've seen in a while. And I take the fact that they actually got hit by that as evidence thereof.
Final round. Fight.
Players like this, however, tend to try to defend themselves, even when in situations where they should definitely just stand still and defend, with new tricky moves. And this can lead to really bad scenarios, because if you choose the wrong tricky move, your opponent is going to get a lot of damage on you. You're also, of course, as just demonstrated, much more susceptible to the sort of player who just uses uppercut. And as demonstrated on both sides, which is why we come down to sliver of health, one uppercut from one side, one uppercut from another. But, as just said, stay true to yourself and move forward.
Round 1. Fight.
So while this can lead to learning things, what exactly you're learning might not always be realistic enough for real use against other opponents who will just defend, or understand enough of what is going on to consistently beat out your, let's call them shenanigans, even though sometimes they're not. It can be easy to get discouraged from playing like these therefore, because you can definitely end up losing in ways you didn't expect to, and then have to go through a lot of soul searching to figure out whether or not it was that you did the wrong thing, or that your opponent understood you really well, or just that they defend so heavily that you probably should have dialed it down a bit. Similarly, it also means that you learn less situations outright. It can be difficult in a match like this one, where things are happening very fast and basically the same thing never repeats itself. You end up confused about either frame data or move interactions, even though your intent was to take advantage of it. This is less so in other games where the action is faster paced and the combos and similar tend to just work. The so-called anime games often involve moves where you could just make sure that it happens correctly either way. But with Street Fighter, where you could drop a combo simply because you were standing one grid square, and I mean the small ones, too far backward, playing like this makes you the sort of person who often needs to watch your replays.
It's go time. Let's do this.
But with a lounge this full, I'm not expecting people to stay around too much once they've lost. After all, most people, you know, want to play. But 8-person lounges are useful when you definitely don't want to play that much and are picking up information while watching. It does look like our Ed has headed out though.
Ryu.
The thing to understand is that even if this player changes to never hitting buttons and only more or less throwing out the occasional Hadouken, you shouldn't assume that they have changed to suddenly be a timid player. Because in certain matchups, the bold thing to do is to wait for your opponent to make a specific type of mistake. That said, we're expecting more explosiveness because these two are likely to have that sort of interaction. Understanding how to mess with each other's spacing, for example. If anything, our Karine is probably the one who is likely to need to move around a little less, but probably not so much less that it's a big problem. That is another really good example of how a player can be bold even though they're on defense. I'm going to move to this spot where I know you have no options and just counter whatever you do because I've set up the entire situation to that. Similarly, being really confident that you don't have to move because your opponent's mind state or the next thing in their sequence, if you can call it that, is to do something that you're able to counter. It's not really about remaining in a defensive stance fully, because you could switch to one offense if they decided, well, I'm not falling for that, I'm moving. but often you're waiting for them to do that too. Karina is a character who can move across the screen quickly enough that this is a real option for her. To get the opponent to a position where they know they can't attack her, and then take advantage of it by moving into their space. This is different than trying to hit the opponent because they managed to keep avoiding you.
Fight.
And you can tell because, again, this is, I'm moving forward now because I don't know what else to do and therefore I'm going to attack. That's technically the timid response most of the time. I can't stop you from doing whatever it is that I'm losing to, so I'm going to just do more things. When facing this type of player, you often have to be careful that you recognize your moves can whiff in positions you really didn't expect them to. Because this type of player is usually moving around and is willing to hit more buttons, more normals, and those normals may have innate motion to them. Not every character has this as a main thing they do, but the ones that do can often be a problem. Similarly, understanding that there are ranges where there's not much you can do against your opponent's attacks other than retreat. And knowing, okay, this player knows enough ranges that I need to get out of this spot. I can't be confident that if they do something here, it's going to mean that I have an advantage. From the timid player side, you can be reasonably sure you're going to have the advantage if they do anything, but you can't be sure if they're going to do anything. This is also, in fact, a whole sequence of taking risks.
Round 2.
I believe that this player understands that Karin can counter those neutral jumps, particularly at the ranges they were doing them. But if she messes it up, they get more out of it than sitting around and hoping for something else to happen. And there we see an immediate switch to, oh, I was defending, but you're not coming forward. Don't worry, I have a whole plan for how to attack you too. I don't want to claim that this is regional, but there are definitely regions of the world where it is more common to find the sort of player that does this heavy movement style. And that went about as it goes between these two types of player.
You lose. Let's do this. Round one.
Is also relatively old, even though it doesn't necessarily show, because the wolf prefers to have longer setups before doing such things.
Round two. Fight.
But those are not usually meant to cover situations so that he can hurt or attack. They're more so to experiment and see what movement the opponent will use. So you'll get things like that there with the extremely perfectly spaced disc guidance, because, oh, I can get away with this right now, so I'm just going to do that. What makes it harder for the Kali is that unlike Alex, with no armored moves, there's much less threat for I'm going to suddenly get to you and throw you or command grab. Which has been giving some issue. But that, on the other hand, is basically exactly how we expect that to go. Use that explosive strength. And similarly, from our Ryu side, they just basically went, okay, well, I'm going to come at you anyway. And I have a method, and I'm going to hit you, and then they did. In order to get really, really good at this, though, you must often overwhelm an opponent, and to overwhelm someone who is higher level is obviously harder. From the other side, it's the same thing. If you are defensive and generally waiting and trying to get your opponent to do something wrong, you start to lose much more when you meet opponents who are strong enough who just don't do things wrong. Unfamiliarity is the way you get through most things. So neither of these methods really changes how one ranks up or the likelihood of winning matches or anything. In fact, the only one that really does this is the tendency to taunt, and even then, Many players who are at higher ranks are the type who are not easily flustered, frustrated, or taunted, so using your capacity to annoy people to make them make mistakes you can then punish, or to get chances before attacking that they are too flustered to counter, only works until you meet someone who just doesn't react to it at all. It does, however, require slightly less physical skill at the game. That's a matter of understanding player psychology and what exactly you need to do to frustrate or annoy any given player.
You win.
Which is also a skill that one usually needs to develop to get particularly high up. In rank and in certain forms of skill. If you want to say, I can play this game at a high level, you often have to know how to get into your opponent's head enough to cause them to have incorrect reactions.
Round 1.
And not just have incorrect reactions because you don't understand what's happening, or because you have been stressed by a specific thing happening over and over that you don't know how to stop very well. A large part of playing against this style of player is simply readiness. And that can be trained just by practicing more basically at all. You don't need really to have offense to manage to make out against this type of player. Not even because they will quote-unquote eventually make a mistake, but simply that so much of their offense is based on taking you off guard that if you simply never fall into that, then you generally won't get hurt. And in order to keep that going, by the nature of fighting games, eventually they have to do something risky. And if you happen to be blocking at the moment they do that something risky, then you usually get a punish if you are aware enough of what's happening to do your punish properly. From the psychological perspective though, that style of player who does defend more has a minor advantage. If you're not familiar with all this, then you will probably find yourself feeling very differently, because the player who plays boldly can only say to themselves, why did I do that way, or I thought that worked but I was wrong, and be disappointed. The player who plays defensively and timidly can say to themselves, well, I just need to punish that. It's a very binary reaction of I didn't punish, or I let down my guard in some small way long enough because I misunderstood something. I can avoid that in future. And that can help them to play the game more, which is an actual advantage. If you're just not easily discouraged while playing because of something you're interacting with, then you can play more often, and the more often you play, the more practice you get. But this is relatively easily balanced out by simply becoming the sort of person who plays from the heart, as they say, who plays with this explosive concept of this is a thing I can do and I'll probably manage to land this attack. And when you fail, just consider whether or not it definitely was going to fail. If you had an error, or if you thought it was going to work for a valid enough reason, because you can totally go, a really good opponent would uppercut me.
You win.
But even really good opponents sometimes just don't actually uppercut, because they're so caught up in everything else going on that they don't get to the point of being ready to uppercut. And recognizing that you can put even relatively strong players into that state can help you think about how to push forward. Looks like they're out for now. This is a Win 10 Battle Lounge matches week, so we expected to see more people. And that has more or less turned out to be true. Not sure what happened to our loot though, so I should probably check into that. Now this magic is less common, but probably good that we finally got it. Since these players have generally played Akira and Ed against each other for the fun part of it. But then I therefore get to talk about the fact that these two characters are really bad at hitting each other. The various interactions of their hitboxes, hurtboxes, pushback, positions, everything means that they spend a lot of time whiffing buttons at each other, or hitting the first hit of a combo but not being in range for the rest of it. So, it requires a lot of practicing combos that aren't the norm, at least if you're going to be playing standard neutral. Once you're close in pressure, sure, it's a little bit closer to normal. But even things like that where you're just like, okay, I went for the combo, why did you only the very corner of my Psycho Inferno hit? Because of this, it's actually really good to stay on defense in this matchup when you don't know what's about to happen. But that's the quote-unquote timid player method. I'm not sure what is going to happen here, and I don't want something bad to happen, so I'm going to stay on defense. And this is completely correct in most matchups, because most opponents advance on you when they want to try to trick you or trap you or similar.
Round one.
But these two, even though they technically could, don't benefit a lot from actually doing it. It's not necessarily changed too much by doing longer range moves either. In fact, the only thing I've seen help is using more meter in neutral to set up situations that you prefer, rather than having to deal with the problems you've got. This is of course expensive and makes dealing with the opponents more complicated as you go.
Round two.
Fortunately, this matchup doesn't really require either player to have meter for anything specific in terms of either pressure or defense. Therefore, they can use it all for creative things and just generally longer punishes than they would normally be available. So, now that Sakura is sufficiently used to playing Akira, this is probably a matchup that they need to have, at least occasionally. It's probably less fun than the Ed Akira matchup, but still worth having.
Final round. Fight.
It can end up being very subtle, because you can get around specific types of things players do by just being more willing to either defend or do incredibly unsafe attacks, simply because you think that by the time your opponent has figured out what the attack you did was, they'll still fail to punish. You only really have to do this sort of thing once, and then you're set. From the defense side, it's often going for something that looks like pressure, and then just defending immediately. But this definitely looks like it's going to be one of those things where they have to actually train repeatedly. Because the amount of I have missed even though I thought I was in range that this matchup has had so far, it exceeds even my expectations.
And Bison wins.
I'm very tempted to interpret this player's name in Morse code. Which really reminds me that I don't know enough Morse code. I know it begins with S. Let's see what we get. I know it was 3 dashes or shorts at the beginning. Long. That's a K. Then long, short, long again.
Round one.
That doesn't seem to make much sense. And a G. No, that's probably not what it is. Unfortunately, it is too repetitive to assume anything much about it. Oh well. I guess that could be a Y.
Round two. Fight.
But no, unless their intention was to name themselves SYWJPK or something, I'm going to assume that they just hit a lot of things. That is probably the best explanation in that moment just now of what a bold player does when they don't feel like attacking. They stand there and assume that no matter what you do, the position they're in will allow them to respond. And you absolutely can get to that point in games, places where you just absolutely can respond to everything. This is compounded by the fact that, I mean, just by playing this character. So we've come across what might be our first timid player. In general, if you want a base strategy you can just throw out and use in early matches against timid players, just V-reversal a lot, because they're not usually the type who will be setting up the V-reversal, because that would require to be thinking about taking a specific type of risk. Their defenses are usually set pretty heavily, but this is Mika, so there is the possibility that you will not get that to work out for you. Whether or not V-Shift works is more or less going to be decided by whether or not their character's buttons continue to pursue you enough to hit you. But in general, it's once again assume they're going to hit buttons because they need to hit buttons in order for things to not happen from your side. So even though this looks like this is the same sort of high aggressive explosiveness, it's technically the opposite reason for that.
Mika wins.
In this case, taking advantage of the fact that this matchup is technically favored toward Mika enough that it is a tournament sort of thing, at least some of the time, for just fine to switch to Mika instead of playing the Bison mirror match, depending on the opponent obviously, but it is a thing that you just do because Bison lacking the invincible wake up, having a V-reversal that is relatively slow enough to get caught in Mika stuff, and needing to hold down back enough to get certain moves, means that she can do a lot more than she can in other matchups. The one thing she doesn't get to do is jump, but Bison doesn't get to jump or go into the air either because wingless airplane is effective against a lot of things. But let's see if that actually holds true and my analysis of this player is correct. Because Nakali is a character that actually has an invincible uppercut. And that would mean that you would only want to hit buttons just enough. A demonstration of how even the same player will change behavior based on a matchup due to whether or not they are in the bold or timid category. If you can get enough of a life lead, you don't necessarily care whether or not your opponent uses the invincible wake up or not. And that moment just now is a really good demonstration of what exactly it is you can use to tell. If you have nothing else, if you can't figure it out, try to see if your opponent will hit buttons just to make you block. Not with any expectation whatsoever that is going to open you up, not with buttons that will benefit them if you don't block, just, I'm hitting more buttons so that you don't. And even if you don't necessarily consider players to be bold or timid in that regard, that is something you can just immediately take as helpful, because that is a behavior you can take advantage of or make build your expectations around, basically. In order to
Mika
defeat this
wins.
type of player, sometimes you have to be really good at checking the dash, because if they hit buttons enough to get to the point of, okay, I'm pretty sure you're not going to hit buttons now, then they'll dash. But the dash is just another, okay, I should probably do something other than just hit this button before you get
Round
wise.
one.
So let me go for something that actually lands damage. Mika's a good character for this style of play actually, so I'm basically happy for them having found a character that works so well for it. She has pushback strings that will eventually get her to the point of having buttons you can't easily counter unless you're really ready for them, that are then advantaged. She also has just enough range to get something out of doing it. So, this particular form of twitchiness works quite well with this character. She does a lot of damage as well, which compounds the whole thing. And then we get to the I'm backing off now. But note that after all of that backing off, our Nakali jumped and they still didn't actually leave this airplane. This is because they're not necessarily backing off to be ready to do the correct thing. They're backing off to avoid having to.
Mika wins.
Unfortunately for this player style, they don't often do super well in ranked because the specific way you have to go through ranked, you have to be able to beat every character you come across with this style. And that part can be fairly hard. You have to build up a lot of specific character knowledge in order to consistently beat everyone, because some characters will have tools that make this style just not work particularly well. Or you might meet a player who is used to dealing with this because either that's their own style, they've faced enough other players that did it, or have a friend that plays this way and they just know what to do, and so on. I don't expect that Arcarine is going to be that player, but she can still make a relatively large shift to the way she normally plays in order to adapt to this, and then we'll have to see whether or not the Mika player can adapt to their own things. Generally, this is a matter of being ready to be reversal if you have that much power, understanding that your opponent doesn't necessarily have a counter to you, so you don't have to use crazier stuff, and getting out of the way or either forward or back dashing in those situations. This opponent is counting on the fact that you will try to hit buttons out of their stuff, but they are hitting more buttons than you.
Round 2. Fight.
So it's a very tactical sort of thing. If I have to beat this sort of player, I just do nothing for incredibly long periods of time, because they don't usually have their own concept of what to do. And it allows me to watch for where the hole in their offense is. There's almost always some hole. But thankfully, this is Rainbow Mika, and there isn't really so much of a hole in their offense. Similarly, our Arcarine responds to this sort of stress by doing very specific things all the time, which are exactly the things that the Mika player would have learned to defeat. Therefore, doing absolutely the minimum possible is more likely to stress this player than managing to hit them. But this must be tempered with not getting stressed oneself, and being forced to use unfamiliar responses in order to play well and survive is the definition of stress in this game. We see there, for example, aiming at the sweep even though the player is not going to want you to be able to do anything. Or moving there because footsies is about to happen, but not really because they're not going to do buttons because they don't think they can beat Karina footsies. etc. With enough practice, this whole situation just becomes waiting for this player to come up with something else they can do. But unfortunately for them, both their rank and their style probably indicate that they don't have a lot of other things they can do. And Kareen, unfortunately for them, has way too many tools for dealing with all of their stuff. This moment, for example, is literally I could walk forward. Against this sort of opponent, I literally walk forward because they don't really have anything else they do. But that is the incorrect thing to do because you're trying to hit them and they are walking backwards explicitly to prevent there being any chance of them actually getting hit. So,
You lose.
it is good in that it is capable of being very stressful. And learning to control your stress so that it doesn't overwhelm you is an incredibly important part of this game. The Wolf, on the other hand, might have a little bit easier time of this because the way the Wolf adapts to people, particularly people who play like this, tends to be more effective. It's helped along by the fact that Necalli has less responses and they are generally more effective overall responses. They don't do as much damage, they don't give as much advantage if the opponent decides to stop midway, but they are more consistently effective at avoiding the situation, and therefore can be used without as much thinking about it, meaning they're less stressful. One problem that will come up is that a player who plays like this more or less cuts off Necalli's options for using special moves. Because, well, good special moves anyway. And if you cut off both Necalli's option of using specials and make it a bad idea to actually wait for the trigger or to activate it, then things are going to be rough. Mika is also a character who is good at avoiding the situation that comes up so often, where this sort of play leads to you not having the life lead and then getting beat up, or losing out because you must rush in to try to get it. Once you've got enough of a life lead through Mika's explosive power at the beginning, before your opponent can get her off them with the reversals, then you don't really have to worry as much. But here, the Wolf has probably remembered it, and this is a relatively negative situation for our Mika player. They don't have the advantage in terms of meter, and they could be reversaled off without managing to get enough of a life lead. But that particular moment of choosing to bait in is really good. Because that's part of conditioning. Your opponent should uppercut at some point, and just picking the right point is enough. This is also because technically the Wolf is on the timid side of players as well. While he's one of those players that adapts quite often to the way the opponent is playing, when it doesn't even have to be stressed, when overwhelmed by the number of options available to the opponent, it's usually the timidity that wins out. This is probably at least somewhat related to the style of character played, because Necalli is not really great at suddenly going on offense, but it doesn't really matter a lot either. One thing that is important to recognize though, especially when facing this style of player, is you can absolutely just walk forward. As long as they are staying out of the range where you could land a hit and seem to have any interest in staying there, you can walk forward completely freely. Because they will always move to where you can't hit them with the intention of making you do something like that. But because you can't hit them, unless they're playing a super zony character, like Dalsim, Manat, or Poison, they can't hit you either, which means you are in zero danger for as long as you choose to continue walking forward. Just make sure to take a break every now and again, but most of the time you don't even need to block. Mika's definitely a character where you probably don't need to block. Unfortunately, the way that the team trains makes them relatively weak to this sort of player. And that compounds because the upper silver ranks are basically just this type of player, because they're all trying their best to get into the gold ranks.
Let's do this.
Akuma isn't terribly well suited to doing this. Akuma's buttons, moveset, ranges don't lead to this being easy. In fact, it allows Mika to go on slightly more offense because the idea is I can overwhelm you before anything happens. And this is often just true. Being more frustrating is definitely a style that helps here. But while Akuma doesn't have a lot of options, there are two that do help. The first is just light beam and flip in nearly any position. This is because Mika's moves don't normally get her into the position where she will not have the move. The second thing is that you can get Mika to waste a certain amount of energy trying to punish specific things Akuma can do, namely light uppercut.
Round one. Fight!
Players are also much more susceptible to just being tricked like that. You give them the idea that they will be able to punish something, and then just work around it.
Round two.
It's also probably the most frustrating thing they generally face, because feeling like you have control of the match because your opponent is about to make an attack and make a mistake can throw you off a lot when they make an attack, but the attack isn't a mistake. You can end up feeling as if you were the one that made the mistake, or worse, end up simply not understanding what just happened. But as noted, this doesn't work terribly well because Akuma has to use too much energy for this to work. And the precision required to therefore do it is something you have to build up against players who do this. But players who do this are rare because it doesn't really help for long.
Let's do this.
Despite his continuing to play Bison, which is probably good because understanding how to deal with this when you don't really have a lot of physical options with your character to deal with the situation can be really important. But she's also not the most deceptive of players, which is going to be required simply because of that. Bison doesn't really have a lot of ways of dealing with this other than tricking you into trying to do things that she shouldn't do. And those sorts of things often require you to hit the quote-unquote wrong button. In fact, it is that understanding of the buttons that normally don't work, the buttons that are normally bad ideas, understanding that those buttons have become good ideas is a very large part of this game. For example, here, there are many things Bison can do that are more expected, more normal to be doing. But which one is the, let's call it most incorrect? The button that is normally your most incorrect option is often the one you want against this sort of player, because that's the one they're not expecting.
Mika wins.
But this isn't a matter of just going for something crazy, because usually that means that you're going to do something punishable. Bison doesn't have to go that far though, thankfully. Bison has head stomp. Just head stomp, regular head stomp. And the reason why regular head stomp works is because this sort of player, while they can counter it, are usually looking for something else to do or something else to happen. That said, the concept of I'm going to play footsies now isn't really in here. This player has not played footsies once. They have hit buttons in neutral, but that's not what playing footsies is usually considered to be. We are seeing part of the taunt part though, which is a good thing to be using here, because if you realize that you are the type who hits a lot of buttons to prevent your opponent from doing anything, doing that in the most taunting way possible is the most likely thing to make the most mistakes. But you saw this whole sequence, because that's again more or less how this works. there is a spacing where normally you'd want to play footsies, wait for something to happen, expect that your opponent is going to take something more serious as their offense and be ready for something else. But here you can just head stomp because the thing they're doing requires the head stomp. What can't easily be done, as just demonstrated, is using the head stomp as an offense. The rapid switching of mode between I am defending by hitting buttons and I am defending by standing still is something that's really hard for people to keep up with. Because the general feeling is, my opponent has stopped their constant barrage of buttons, I should figure out how to play offense. But the fact that they've stopped is exactly the time you shouldn't do any offense. Their goal in that moment of stopping is usually that they have managed to, with all of their buttons, put you at the spot where you don't get to do anything. Or at least nothing that they can't react to. You could try to go for a advantaged move, but that will usually just put you close to them, and they're going to keep blocking most of the time, and probably still tech the throw if they're particularly good. And it's for that reason that one has to build up a lot of trickery, because the opponent can only really be dealt with by convincing them to hit a button when they shouldn't. And therefore this is a thing you have to learn. Ocarina's learned to do this mostly against Fang, and while the button used for Fang is not necessarily the correct button to use here, it's not a bad one. Just hitting heavy kick will probably help in certain situations, but without the experience to back up the knowledge, without the knowledge to back up that, okay, it's time to hit heavy kick, then nothing will happen. This, for example, is another moment where you just walk forward. But it's obviously, if you just walk forward, you might get hit. Mostly you're walking forward with the watching of your opponent to see, did they move backward? You get some good options out of neutral jumping or forward jumping in those exact moments, but even then, there's still too much you have to think about. You have to understand what buttons they have available and make those buttons miss in some way. Karine is not quite as good at doing this compared to certain other characters, which makes her life a little harder.
You lose.
The art of walking up to someone who must hit a button to stop you, and then hitting the button that will evade and hit them, is a really high-level skill, because it requires you to understand so much about everyone's interacting buttons.
Round one. Fight!
Karine can do decently well with just her heavy kick and heavy punch though. And since both of these offer good options, the problem I'm expecting to see from our Karine is more or less disbelief that she can just win the entire match that way. Because you can. That's all you need to do. The hard part then becomes knowing when to keep doing it, when to stop, whether or not you should go in harder, etc. But you absolutely can win these matches by just doing that, which is the power of Justin Wong. Justin Wong is able to beat people by hitting the exact same button for the entire round, mainly because of this level of understanding. Unfortunately, it looks like our Karine is still conditioned to hit things after the heavy kick, so it's more likely she's going to end up moving into positions she doesn't want to be in. But even then, you've just seen, that is a moment that Justin would have managed to do something, because Justin would hit the heavy kick, know that the heavy kick whiffed, watch the opponent whiff, and then go, you're going to do something else. Because Justin would have, let's say, let go of the heavy kick as soon as they hit the button. They're no longer mentally committed to anything that happens after the heavy kick. They're watching to see what the opponent does. Mentally committing yourself to things in your moveset because you need them to hit or feel the need to have them hit is one of the things that holds back mid-level players the most in this game. We do fortunately have bots and katas intended to train it, but it's hard to understand exactly what you're training sometimes, because putting into words the fact that you need to, especially against the bot, hit a button and then clear your mind of the fact that you've hit it is a self-discipline thing almost. It's not just reactive. It's not just a matter of the bot did this, I did this, I've done this thing correctly. It's a whole specific mindset that you must train. So while the tools are available, you can't necessarily know how to use them right away.
Round one. Round two. Fight.
You can watch it happen here in real time, in fact. Dwarf is the timid type of player who, when faced with this, doesn't hit buttons. As noted, it won't lead to anything because the opponent will just overwhelm. But whereas everyone else has usually lost because of hitting too many, or hitting the ones that feel like they should work and being wrong, Dwarf is likely to just not hit anything because of not knowing what's going to keep happening. And that's technically a decent way to do this to a point, because against most other characters, you can just stay there blocking the whole time. In order for them to get into range or to do things that actually matter,
Round one.
they have to stop hitting buttons and actually step forward or something. Mika is probably among the best characters in this game for not having to do that. She can continue to press buttons in ways that will pull her forward enough that you probably don't get to do anything at all. And when she is close to you, you have to deal with everything she does when she's close, which is a lot. So with yourself placed under that particular strain, things get much harder. That's odd. Why does that hit? I guess you're not invincible anymore because the move out is actually an attack. Most people experience this through Ken. Ken players often know this specific flowchart sequence that puts them in a position where they can do cross-ups where the opponent can't hit buttons in response, and so on. The useful part about this is, in terms of understanding, is that this isn't a Mika thing that matters relative to the bot we have. Not only does the bot partially do some of this already, but the thing that this player is doing isn't really related to the character. She's just one of the better characters in the game at actually executing it. You see this often with Kage as well. There are many Kage players that know how to do basically this. Kage, unfortunately for him as a character, has a gap and no command grab. So there is a gap you can learn where Kage must jump, and you can dash under Kage's jump or be ready in some other way. And this puts Kage at the spacing where it doesn't really have an approach right then. Certain implementations or uses of Kage's V skill and V trigger can prevent you from needing to jump or give you some options for chasing down things if your opponent attempts to escape afterward, but it's not really the same. Against Mika, you can backdash, but you're usually backdashing at the moment you believe she's going to jump, rather than backdashing because
Round one.
she has actually jumped.
Round two. Fight.
The sort of player also learns to, let's say, sense when you're going to respond to the thing they're doing. Which is why they also end up learning to bait stuff. That innate sense of, okay, it's my turn now, is really helpful.
Mika wins. Round one. Fight.
I think there is a gap here where Akuma does get to at least parry, but I'm not sure what the parry requirement is. There, for example, you see something very equivalent to the gap that Kage creates. That particular sequence doesn't really have a follow-up other than I'm going to do dropkick or I'm going to jump.
Round two.
The problem being that if you forward dash into a dropkick, things get kind of simple. Unfortunately, bots cannot teach you how to trick people. So, you're left with nothing to do but watch and learn all of the gaps in the strings, or when pressure is over.
Mika wins. Let's do this.
In some ways, the title of the stream turned out to be really fitting. If you've ever heard someone tell you that you needed more experience to play a game, that it generally means this sort of thing. This moment where understanding this is a gap, this is a gap, this is a gap, this is exactly what I get to do in this gap. That's what they're talking about. Because getting used to your opponent's strings and attacks and gaps can be extremely difficult. This is particularly harder when you're still trying to actually win the match.
Round two. Fight.
I, as the observer, have had time to see every single thing so far. But really, it doesn't come down to that. But notice the sort of thing that has just happened. More or less twice, the opponent found you have countered my gap. And after the second one, they kind of stopped moving. This is relatively common in the game. If you know enough ways to stop people's gaps, they're basically relying on a bag of tricks, and then when you've countered them all, even if you couldn't counter them every time, just demonstrating that you can do it often enough to win often causes them to just kind of stop. Understanding what exactly that kind of stop is, and the difference between that one and the other one where they are stopping because it's time to stop, is a heavy requirement. But you saw just now, technically, just by not using a scissor kick that moment was probably the exact thing I'm talking about. So in this situation, Bison has a couple of options, none of which are very clear. Mostly, they revolve around getting Mika to dropkick and parrying the dropkick. But if that's not available, then just waiting for the right moment to go for, in this case, Hell Warp, would be worth it. Unfortunately, Mika's not particularly weak to Hell Warp because of multiple things, so it's not really going to come up a lot. You can Hell Warp at the end of certain of her strings, similarly, but not enough of them that is necessarily going to be super helpful. You end up using the Hell Warp in that moment, where the opponent is now thinking of attacking again themselves. And since Bison's dash is functionally too slow to take this sort of player by surprise, you're not going to have a lot of luck on the offense front.
Mika wins. It's go time. Let's do this.
Ibuki, on the other hand, can actually do this. Unfortunately, our Ibuki is not practiced enough at Ibuki to do it necessarily, but it can be done. And it's not something one does by overwhelming the opponent in any way by just using command dash or anything. It's actually quite the opposite of that. It's the fact that she could do those things that makes it difficult enough for this style of play from Mika's side to actually matter. Because once you realize I have options, you might stop them, but I have them, it's easier to remain calm enough to actually do something to your opponent, such as air throw them or uppercut them or be ready for any number of other things. You'll notice that immediately the match begins with some whiffing of buttons, some trades in positions, and so on. The rhythm of it shifts almost immediately because the character is more capable of countering the style. But again, you would still have to pay attention to all the gaps, like knowing when is this player going to jump and therefore I am going to get to anti-air or air throw them. Or when can I do that, which is again super helpful. Or when should I backdash out of this annoying string, because I can actually backdash out of this and then do something about it because I have a character that can do something here. The opponent is going to try to make this as frustrating as possible, but it's not terribly hard to get out of, it's just that they're convincing you that it's hard to get out of. But once again, no matter what you do, if you're too physically stressed or too mentally stressed due to being unfamiliar, this is really hard. Whereas a player who's been doing this for years will just literally watch this happen, move out of the way, and beat people up.
Round one.
Or, if they're particularly creative, they'll just try different sorts of things. For example, in that position, I think I'd probably go for, what's our hit grab called? Rida? I'm not sure Rida would work, but it's definitely the first thing I would do because I feel this probably pulls back my hurt box, right? So I'm just gonna Rida at you while you're trying to kick me, because if this hits you, man, are you gonna be upset. Similarly, Ibuki doesn't have to do things here. She can, well, that's kind of my point. She has kunai, she has all sorts of weird options that she can just use to annoy the opponent instead of having to go over there. And because she has these things, along with command dashes, other craziness, shuriken, if you're used to using the character enough, if you're used to using this evasive nonsense that you can do, and tricking them, this happens. This is not a match. This is not happening because of player skill per se. This is happening because one character has advantages that are good against the style of player they're up against. And they can absolutely still get this particular, like, run down overhead situation, but it's not enough by itself. You are at least back to having to think about it. Ninja characters are very useful against this style of player. Other characters that are good, interestingly, are Urien, Colleen, and I think Dalsim. Because your goal isn't really to make sure you're beating your opponent. Your goal is to make sure your opponent thinks that they can't beat you. Because if they think they can't beat you, then they're quiet down enough for you to do things. But as I'm literally sitting next to the person playing this character, I can tell you that the stress got to her.
You lose. Let's do this. Round one. KO. Mika wins. Round one. Fight! Round two. Fight!
Depending on your character in this game, sometimes it can be helpful to have secondaries or even tertiary characters whose only job is to deal with this sort of thing.
Mika wins.
To exist simply to throw your opponent off track, off guard enough through their very existence that you don't have to worry about it or think about it anymore. As it is entirely possible to just get an advantage by changing character.
Let's do this.
Unfortunately, our upcoming player, I think, doesn't have any characters for whom that's a really good, idea. I guess Manat, sorta.
Round one.
Oh, this is unfortunate. Well, I'm not sure. Maybe they're done. Though it's probably the perfect capsule to the whole thing we're discussing today. It's much harder to do this sort of thing on G to the players here than it is to do it with Mika. Because G does not have that constant drifting forward on moves, and does not have as quick a command grab, etc. It's also much more obvious where G's gaps are, and the players in this lounge have a clearer understanding of when to try to counterattack G simply based on other parts of the gaps. This is not to say that G doesn't have mix-ups, and I mean lots of mix-ups. And those mix-ups are definitely still going to lead to the same sorts of situations. Which meaning that being dominant in certain ways can still absolutely be done. But note how the players actual modus operandi has changed to mostly having to punish. Because G simply doesn't have the tools required to do the thing that Mika has been doing to get the win in the same way. They're going to have to be either more creative or more explosive. Fortunately, having more health helps, but isn't even that by much. Since G can't command grab after specific things, and the ranges are better understood, this is mostly going to come down to G matchup knowledge. Another thing that happens often when you face specific types of player, they will understand the base strategy for a character, and not necessarily too much more. But if you understand how to counter the base strategy, then things go poorly.
G wins. Round 1.
So now that Santerre is back in the rhythm of fighting this character, let's see what happens. You'll notice the same "I'm still hitting more buttons" thing comes up. Whereas our previous G was timid in the other way, and just like not do things and hope people mess up. This player has already demonstrated that their style of doing this is to do more things. Including that.
Round 2. Fight.
Did you like that?
I'm so interested in this match right now. This is the moment that's going to decide this one, because this is the moment where it's a matter of, can I use this basically overpowering thing to get in and hit stuff? Ooh, dash worked in time. Unfortunately, reacting to dashes with your V trigger is usually not enough to beat the dash. So we've basically come to the end of our stream. This will probably be the last on-stream match of the night.
Let's do this.
We didn't end up, in fact, dealing with Luke, but we got a lot out of it. the backdash. Backdash positioning. That backdash is not conditioned, which means that she had to use work for that one. But it may be enough almost by itself. In a tournament match, that would be a moment to just win by that whole thing happening. By the opponent stopping it, you can, in fact, just win that way. Never believe that because your opponent has the power to quickly reverse the situation, that you should worry about them doing it. The only thing you need to do is calm yourself as much as you can and not get too relaxed about anything. Because if you get too relaxed in specific ways, then you'll miss your chance. But it is often true of this sort of player that their actual offensive skill in neutral is poor. Because it often comes up that for you to believe that this style of play works particularly well long term, you have to believe that everyone else's is basically as poor as yours. Miss the cycle pressure. Effective trickery. But the hop taunt eventually works out. I think that can only be parried if it whiffed on one of the hits before. So again, it's a matter of tons of technical knowledge and reactions to go with that technical knowledge. I'm pretty sure if you can make Mika whiff one of the kicks, the next one is parryable.
Round 1.
But I don't think you can actually parry them the other way.
Round 2. Fight.
That sort of thing. That moment is when you feel, I have learned something.
Final round. Fight.
And it is that sort of thing that lets you feel, okay, no, I can see how this game is more than just standing here being annoyed by this person. There is a way to do this, I just would never have thought of it, or it seems so dangerous, or any number of little things that come up when you find yourself facing this sort of player. Look for them, because generally it's not really going to be a thing there's not much you can do to beat this sort of player the other way. They spend almost all of their time practicing the method that defeats nearly anyone who has any other response. But eventually, you can learn to not be overwhelmed by this. You can learn to not be overwhelmed by that. Is our stream for the night, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. This has been Brilliant for Team 2MK. Good luck and good night, everyone.